Is America currently facing an existential threat from within?
That's a heavy question.
It is. But that's the fiery claim recently made on the floor of the U.S. House.
Right.
And it puts core American values directly against a deeply rooted religious and legal code.
And this isn't just, political talk. It's a really high-stakes clash over where rights come from, what due process even means, and ultimately who gets the final say on the law.
Yeah, this has moved way beyond the campaign trail. It's happening in federal courtrooms right now.
Right. And the whole thing that kicked this off for our deep dive today was a pretty high-profile speech.
It was from Texas Congressman Keith Self. He stood up and called Sharia law, which is, broadly speaking, the moral and religious law of Islam, an existential threat to the U.S.
And what's really interesting is how he framed it. He didn't just say they were different. He said the U.S. Constitution and Sharia are, quote, fundamentally at odds.
And he pointed to the very first words, didn't he?
He did. He said the Constitution begins with we the people. Authority comes from us. Whereas Sharia, he argues, dictates Allah has said, which asserts its own supremacy over any man-made law.
So that's the core of it, divine law versus popular sovereignty. And that's really the pillar of the conservative argument we're going to unpack.
The claim is that because Sharia asserts this higher supreme legal standing, it just can't coexist with the American Republic.
But while this argument is being made in Congress, there's a whole other side to this.
A very active one. You have civil rights groups on the ground, like the Council on American Islamic Relations or AIR Texas.
And they're pushing back hard.
Oh, absolutely. They're condemning this kind of rhetoric from politicians in Texas, including Governor Greg Abbott. They're calling it unconstitutional and defamatory.
And they're not just issuing press releases. They're filing lawsuits to block these policies.
Which brings us to our mission for you today.
First, we need to really grasp the specific, stark contrasts that Congressman Self cited between Western values and Sharia. You need to understand the case he's making.
And then we have to immediately pivot and look at the intense legal and political resistance that this whole perspective has created.
So let's start with the foundation of the conflict, as laid out by the congressman, the very premise of rights.
Okay, so this is the core philosophical difference he lays out.
Congressman Self says America's culture is Christian-based. It's founded on the idea that rights come from our Creator. They're natural rights.
Yeah.
Not something the government gives you.
Right. And the argument he makes is that Sharia is, well, it's just completely at odds with the whole idea of individual freedom.
Why? What's the reason?
Because, in that view, rights are decreed by a divine legal code. They can be interpreted and maybe even taken away by that code. They aren't seen as inherent to every person.
He also makes a point about evolution, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, he claims there's a stagnation.
Ooh.
The argument presented is that Western civilization evolved through the Enlightenment to our Constitution.
But he claims that Islam, or specifically Sharia, is stuck in the 8th century.
And he warns that if those beliefs were imposed here, it would drag the U.S. back to the Dark Ages. It's a pretty stark warning.
And the sources he uses move pretty quickly from philosophy to very tangible legal differences.
Especially around equality and justice.
The Declaration says all men are created equal.
Right. But the congressman's interpretation of Sharia law directly challenges that in a courtroom setting. For instance, he says the testimony of a non-Muslim is considered invalid against a Muslim.
Invalid, so just thrown out completely.
That's the claim. And on top of that, a woman's testimony is valued at only 1/2 that of a man's.
So what does that mean for something like due process then?
It means, from this perspective, that some people are automatically second-class citizens under the law.
Which would be in direct conflict with the Sixth Amendment.
Exactly. The Sixth Amendment guarantees an impartial jury. The congressman argues a Sharia court can't possibly meet that standard if testimony is legally limited based on your religion or your gender. It's just a fundamental clash.
The source material goes on to detail some really stark contrasts about marriage and personal freedom, too.
Absolutely. The claim is that Sharia prohibits a Muslim woman from marrying a non-Muslim man, but it does allow the reverse.
And what about divorce?
That's another big one. He says men are granted an unconditional right to divorce, but women often are not.
These are seen as attacks on what the West would call basic gender equality.
Right. And then you get to slavery and punishments.
Okay, so the 13th Amendment abolished slavery here.
Yes, but Congressman Self asserts there has never been an abolition movement within Islam. He points out that the Quran and Hadith have rules for managing slaves and the slave trade.
And this connects to the punishments he cited.
It does. Things like stoning for adultery, public beatings, amputation for theft, even execution of Christians and Jews. The argument is these aren't just cultural differences. They're legally sanctioned acts that contradict everything we understand about human rights.
Okay, let's pivot. How does all of this, in the congressman's view, become a domestic threat to our First Amendment?
This is really the core of his existential threat argument. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech and religion.
And that includes the freedom from religion, the right to change your mind.
Exactly. But the sources explain that under Sharia, freedom of religion means you are free to join Islam, but you are never free to leave it.
And leaving is called apostasy.
And it's punishable by death. That's a direct, irreconcilable contradiction with American religious liberty.
What about freedom of speech?
Another huge point of conflict. The congressman points to the author Salman Rushdie, who was stabbed because of a fatwa issued over his writing.
So criticizing Islam, Muhammad, or the Quran can result in severe punishment.
That's the argument. Whereas in the U.S., our Constitution protects all expression, even and especially criticism. You can't have both systems at once.
This leads to his most aggressive point, the one about an intent to dominate.
Right. He warns that things that are acceptable actions in Sharia are just flat out illegal in America.
Like what?
He cites honor killings, child marriage, and spouse abuse as examples.
And he backs this up with a quote, I believe.
He does. He cited an imam in New York City who supposedly proclaimed, "We will not stop until Islam enters every home."
So he takes that as proof of an intent to dominate Western civilization.
And to destroy us from within. He concludes that our current legal system isn't enough to handle this, and Congress needs to act to defeat the Sharia advances in America.
Okay, so we've laid out that argument pretty clearly. The U.S. Constitution and Sharia are incompatible, and one poses an existential threat to the other.
But that is only half of the story we're looking at today.
Right. Now we have to turn to the counter-narrative, which frames this entire political movement as institutional Islamophobia.
And it's a narrative supported by its own set of evidence detailing discrimination and legal fights faced by American Muslims.
So while some politicians are sounding this alarm, other sources are pointing to a documented history of targeting, especially since 9/11.
Right. Some scholars, for instance, view the Trump administration as having created one of the most openly Islamophobic climates in recent history. They point to politicians openly calling for restrictions on Muslim religious liberty.
And this wasn't just rhetoric, was it? The sources point to actual government actions.
Absolutely. Think about policies after 9/11, like the Patriot Act or specific registration systems that were widely seen as targeting Muslim and Arab communities.
And the NYPD's Mosque Crawlers program.
A decade-long surveillance program, secretly spying on Muslims. All of this led to very real fears of becoming, second-class citizens.
The sources also have hard numbers on how this affected people's daily lives, like getting a job.
It's pretty shocking. The EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, reported that discrimination claims from Muslims shot up by almost 250% after 9/11.
And there's a study you mentioned.
Yeah, a 2013 study. Nationally, it found Muslims got 13% fewer callbacks for jobs than Christians with the exact same resume.
But the political divide made it worse.
Much worse.
Yeah.
In areas with a lot of Republican voters, Christians got almost 4 times as many callbacks as Muslims. It suggests that political hostility has a direct economic impact.
This hostility has also led to some very public, very ugly conflicts.
For sure. Look at the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro in Tennessee. It faced arson, bomb threats. People fought its construction for years.
And lawyers actually argued in court that Islam shouldn't even be protected by the First Amendment.
Right, which shows you just how deep this cultural battle goes. It's a fight over the most basic definitions of American freedom.
And that's why the legal resistance has become so organized and active.
CARE Texas is a prime example. They're not just responding to individual hate crimes, though they do that like calling for a probe after a 3-year-old Muslim girl was allegedly the victim of an attempted drowning.
They're going after the state leadership directly.
Exactly. They condemned Governor Abbott's proclamation against their organization as unconstitutional and defamatory, and then they immediately sued him to block it.
And this brings us to a really complex but super important legal issue that's happening in the background of all of this.
Yes, the doctrine of state legislative privilege.
So for everyone listening, can you break that down? What is it, and why does it matter so much in these civil rights cases?
Okay, so in simple terms, state legislative privilege is a rule that protects lawmakers. It means they don't have to turn over evidence like their emails or notes or discussions about why they passed a certain law.
So if a group like AE wants to challenge a law, saying it's discriminatory, they have to prove the lawmakers intended to discriminate.
Precisely. You have to prove discriminatory intent.
But to prove that, you need the evidence, the receipts. And this privilege shields those very receipts.
That's the bind. You're blocked from getting the very evidence you need to prove your case. And recent court rulings in the 5th, 8th, and 11th circuits have made this privilege even stronger.
They've expanded it.
Massively. It's become exceedingly difficult to get that evidence. The courts are basically making it harder for civil rights groups to use the judicial system to check legislative power.
So if we connect this all back, these legal fights really show this deep institutional tension.
It's state legislative power on one side, and the ability of citizens to hold that power accountable on the other, especially when politically charged claims of discrimination are involved.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? We've really walked through two deeply opposing narratives here.
They're both very high stakes.
On one side, you have the political argument that Sharia presents a genuine existential threat to the Republic based on what they say are stark legal and ethical conflicts with the Constitution.
And on the other side, you have all this evidence and legal action detailing what's described as systemic discrimination, government targeting, and crucially, these legal roadblocks like legislative privilege that make it incredibly hard for citizens to fight back in court.
Both sides are describing a fundamental conflict over who belongs and who defines the rule of law in America.
Which brings us back to something one of the founders said.
John Adams.
John Adams. He said that the Constitution, quote, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.
And looking at all this, it leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it?
It does. In a nation defined by religious freedom and individual rights, how does the government balance its duty to protect its founding principles from what it sees as a threat?
Against its duty to protect all of its citizens from political discrimination and these growing legal barriers. That challenge, finding that balance between security and liberty, is a fundamental test for the future of self-governance.